characters in the amazing story of Abraham and its sequels. Hands down, my favorite character is Jacob. In Jacob's story, we come to learn of God's amazing, expansive love and God's commitment to God's covenant people. Jacob is a covenant human who is far from perfect. Yet God sees in Jacob a work in progress and will not give up on Jacob, no matter how much Jacob seems to mess up with his self-seeking trickery. Jacob's story is a clear portrait of how a relationship with God can be nothing less than a wrestling match which leaves flawed persons transformed. To look at him, you would think Jacob is flawless. We're told he had smooth skin. He was a mother's pet. His mother, Rebecca, adored him and kept him close. In my mind's eye, I imagine Jacob helping his mother in the kitchen, and I cannot help but be tender-hearted. And then, of course, I worry about him, knowing his patriarchal world. I read between the lines and wonder to myself whether Jacob was bullied by other children and scorned for his unmanly looks. Did he learn to protect himself with trickery? I cannot help reading between the lines. His father Isaac certainly did not care much for Jacob. I don't know about you, but I find myself protective and tender-hearted towards Jacob. But Jacob disappoints greatly. Remember when Jacob refused to give his exhausted twin brother food unless he surrendered his birthright? Who does such a mean thing, especially to his own brother, such trickery? It is no wonder I am embarrassed to say I gloat when Jacob is tricked and marries Leah in place of his sweetheart Rachel. Although concerned it is at the expense of Leah, it is somewhat satisfying to see the trickster tricked. And yet, it is this Jacob that God chooses to carry the covenant, warts and all. On the run in the wilderness, fleeing like a refugee from his brother's wrath, Jacob is alone in the desert with only a stone for a pillow and his dream when he dreams of a staircase to heaven. Years later, he hits the mat in a wrestling match with God. All night long, the match goes on. He knows he will lose, and yet he wrestles on. Call him Israel, the one who wrestles with God. The wrestling match is also about God. God allows a mortal man to wrestle with God. One could say that it is the nature of God to welcome the wrestling that serious Bible study brings, and the wrestling that comes from serious engagement with the world, with both its joy as well as its heartbreaks. God allows the wrestling between unequals, the wrestling between the divine and the human. Have you ever wrestled with God? Our rich tradition is filled with those who wrestled with God through discernment when making a difficult decision. Wrestled with God through prayer, begging either for a change of circumstances or acceptance of a situation. Wrestled with God through study, seeking a relationship with God. Wrestled with God through fasting in yearning for a clearer hearing of God's still small voice. And wrestled with God in conversation with fellow disciples who are different in race, ethnicity, as well as economic and social locations. Jacob's wrestling was not just a spiritual experience. After that all-night encounter with God, Jacob is transformed. Jacob finds an emotional reconciliation with his brother Esau. Jacob erects an altar to God at Bethel because God was with him during his meeting with Esau. And at that time, Jacob told his household to get rid of all their foreign gods. I can almost hear him saying, "This means you, Rachel," because she had stolen her father's household gods when the entourage left Laban. Jacob is a complex character. Jacob changed his name to Israel, one who wrestles with God. From his story, we not only see the story of humans who are flawed, but we see even more clearly God who sees the good in us long before we are good. God who gives us grace to wrestle with God, and God who transforms us and restores our broken relationships with others. For many of us, we can do no other than change our very name to reflect this amazing transformation.